Keith Ward is the Regius Professor of Divinity at Oxford University, a canon of Christ Church Cathedral, and the author of many books on religion, including God, Chance, and Necessity and Defending the Soul. I interviewed him at Oxford's Christ Church College and focused especially on his book, Concepts of God. Well, first of all, thanks very much for letting me intrude here. In your book, Concepts of God, you examined a number of faiths: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, or at least particular thinkers within those faiths.
Yeah.
And you concluded that it is reasonable to say that, quote, the same God is worshipped in many diverse faiths. In some sense, it's reasonable to say that. What did you mean by that?
Well, it's fairly easy with Judaism, Islam, and Christianity because the faiths themselves largely claim they're worshipping the same God. It's the God of Abraham. And that God, there might have been different ideas about that God, but it is basically the same God. So there's no problem about that. The difficulty might be if you go to the Indian traditions and you get Vishnu or Shiva and you say, well, is that the same God? Well, the evidence that it is that God, whether most Indians worship either Vishnu or Shiva, two different names of gods, but they're both described by their worshippers as omnipotent and omniscient and good and compassionate and the creator of the universe in some sense. So the descriptions are very similar. So that's the reason I would think you should say that all these great traditions are worshipping the same God.
And what about the concept of, is it pronounced Brahman? Or
yeah, that's an English way of saying it, but that's okay.
Yeah. Does that have some of the properties of the Western God as well?
Brahman, this can be a bit confusing because Brahma, without an N at the end, is a god, is one of the gods, often called the creator god, but one of the gods. But Brahman, with an N, is a neuter term which we could translate as something like absolute reality or the ultimately real. Now, that's not a concept which you do find in the Western traditions, really. And that's why some people think the Indian traditions don't worship God. But Brahman has a personal aspect. So the personal aspect is either Vishnu or Shiva, one of the great gods, really. But it's true, Brahman itself is a more impersonal, I suppose, term for ultimate reality. A bit like Paul Tillich. I mean, if you wanted to go in the Christian tradition and find somebody who talked in that way, Paul Tillich would be a good case. He'd talk about the God beyond God, you know, the being, the power of being beyond the personal image. And so a similar move is actually made.
Is the word Godhead sometimes used to denote this kind of more fundamental dimension of the Western God, or this more abstract dimension or something?
Yes, and it is. The word Godhead is used in that way. And Thomas Aquinas, who's probably one of the best known writers about God in the European tradition, describes God not as a person or even a personal being, but as being of itself subsistent, pure being. Get it in Latin, of course, but pure being, actus purus. And that, again, is a sort of a move to that direction, that ultimately there's something beyond the personal, so that even in the Western Christian tradition, God is personal, but is also a lot more than personal. So there's a similar idea is there as well.
I guess most people would say that the biggest challenge in arguing that in some sense these various faiths are worshiping the same God would be Buddhism. It's sometimes even called an atheistic religion, because the Buddha himself certainly didn't talk about God in the obviously Western sense of the word.
Yeah.
What kind of connection do you make there?
Well, Buddhism is the difficult case, as so often, and it is atheistic, or it's not interested in God. And I don't claim that Buddhists worship God. It's not something I'd want to say. At the same time, there are lots of very interesting similarities. I mean, they're looking in the same direction, you might say, as believers in God. They're looking to, Buddhists are seeking to overcome suffering and various sorts of mental disadvantage, like hatred or lust or desire. And they overcome this by meditation, of course, but the goal is the achievement of nirvana, which is calm and peace and bliss and knowledge. Right, so the connection is this. So they're not talking about God. If you say, what is nirvana? Well, the typical Buddhist will not answer that question. But if you look at how nirvana is described in the text, like the Dhammapada, which is one of the great well-known Buddhist texts, it's described as compassion, knowledge, wisdom, and bliss. And again, those descriptions are very like the ones that a Christian theist might use about God. You say, yes, God is compassionate, God is blissful, God is wise. So while it's not identical, there really are similarities between the objects that Buddhists and Christians are seeking. That is the divine object, in some sense divine. A state beyond the human, and a state beyond suffering. Buddhists don't call that God, it's true, but the similarities are there. So I wouldn't call them believers in God, but I would say they have something recognizable as a spirituality, a way of prayer, which is not unlike the Christian.
So, I mean, a Buddhist in seeking nirvana, in seeking that state of being, is doing in some ways what a Christian would be doing if he or she aspired to a kind of union with God, in a sense. Is that saying too much?
I think that's entirely true. And the more you read in the Christian tradition, people we call the mystics, Teresa of John of the Cross, now they do have a very devotional relationship to Christ, but also they speak very much about the darkness beyond that devotional relationship, the divine darkness, the cloud of unknowing, as one 14th century English mystic called it. And that cloud of unknowing is not unlike nirvana, which you don't speak of because it's silence, but you have some sort of acquaintance with through contemplative prayer. So again, I think, not claiming they're doing the same thing, but they are similar enough in description to say, well, they're looking in the same direction, walking the same path, sort of.
Okay. There are two categories you use for looking at all of these religions. One is what you call the iconic vision, and the other is called self-transcendence.
Yeah.
What do you mean by the iconic vision?
Well, the word icon, it's a Greek word which means image, and the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Orthodox churches have icons all over their churches, which they venerate. And the icon is an image in the sense not just of being a representation or a duplicate, but of somehow conveying the power of the sacred reality which it images. So an icon is something finite, some finite thing, which somehow both represents but also communicates, becomes a vehicle of a real spiritual reality. In the New Testament, Jesus is called the image of the invisible God. He's the icon of the invisible God. And the iconic vision is a way of, is a term that I've used anyway, for thinking of seeing finite things as vehicles of the infinite spiritual reality.
And what about self-transcendence, which is also a kind of quest that you seem to find in all the religions?
Self-transcendence is a term not original with me. It's a term which tries to find its way between two things. One is self-denial, that you give up yourself. And some people object, oh, well, that doesn't value the human enough. You know, you're just giving things up, giving them away. The other is self-fulfillment, which is the Californian dream, I suppose, really. And then people object to that. Oh, well, it's just lying around in a jacuzzi all day, and that's self-fulfillment. So self-transcendence is an attempt to get something between those ways. It's a sort of giving of self, which is also a fulfilling of self. But the two have to go together. And the idea is, well, you've found the greatest fulfillment actually in giving, but not just in pure renunciation for its own sake, but in the joy you get in actually helping other people or being compassionate, and that has its own sort of fulfillment. So self-transcendence is a sort of non-egoistic delight in being. And the connection between the iconic vision and self-transcendence is that if you manage to overcome self-regarding passions, you would find a fulfillment in being then able to see all things as images of the infinite reality. Christians put this sometimes by saying you should see Christ in all things, or you should see everybody as Christ, and that's a way of putting that.
And the basic idea is that the ego biases our perception, distorts our perception of reality.
Yeah.
And you find that idea in all the religions to some extent.
Well, in all the developed religions, yes. I mean, there are some...
In all the what so-called great religions, or the modern...
That's right, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't deny that some religions are horrendous, and human sacrifice is not something that I'd be in favor of. I'm not saying all religions are good, but all the great traditions that we have in the world now, in their best representations, are certainly concerned with that overcoming of ego and self-regard.
Now, I in a way, I associate this most strongly with Buddhism, because Buddhism counsels letting go of the self entirely and achieving ultimate enlightenment that way. But you're saying that this dimension is really fundamental to all the great faiths.
Oh yes, and in Christianity, I mean, Jesus says, unless you take up your cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. And he who loses himself will find himself. So, I mean, the teachings are pretty central to Christian faith.
Yeah, that last phrase in particular is strikingly almost Eastern, I guess.
Well, Jesus was Eastern, of course. I mean, he was a good Palestinian.
Yeah, well, certainly by American standards he was.
Yes. Yeah, we sometimes forget that, but I mean, Christianity is a Middle Eastern religion. Yeah. Certainly.
You talk about the evolution of religions, the idea that whether you look at religion East or West, as the millennia have passed, the doctrines have moved. There are some generalizations you can make about the direction in which the doctrines have moved, right?
I think so.
What would you say by way of generalizing?
Well, as far as we know, the history of early religion and of each of our religious traditions, it was pretty brutal and violent, and there was human sacrifice. There are records, remembrances of human sacrifice in the Old Testament itself. And there were fertility rituals of orgiastic fertility cults, right, orgies, and there were superstitions of various sorts. Now, those things have, on the whole, been controlled and modified or exterminated by developed religion. I mean, there has been a growing perception, I think, in the religious traditions that religion is not about those things. Matter of fact, this happened in principle a very long time ago, and it was in the 8th century BC that the great prophets of the Old Testament, people like Hosea and so on, said God doesn't require sacrifices of animals, but does require justice and mercy. I mean, that was a breakthrough. And I think those sorts of breakthroughs are still happening, breakthroughs of seeing that religion requires a transformation of personal life rather than bribing or propitiating the gods with various sorts of rituals. It's an evolution towards inwardness and self-transformation and away from external ritual. But you can't guarantee that it's always going to get better in that way. But I think you can trace a development of that in religious history. You can see it in the Bible quite fairly clearly, really.
And in the West, you've seen movement toward monotheism, but you wouldn't necessarily say that about the East, I guess. Yes,
I would. I think the Indian traditions are very much misunderstood often in the West. They're almost all monotheistic. That is to say, there are lots of gods, but if you're a worshipper of Vishnu, one of the gods, you'll be a monotheist. That is God. Right. And if you're a worshipper of Shiva, another god, you might say, that is God. It's not they think there really are lots of different gods. They would rather say, if they're reasonably sophisticated, which very many are, they would rather say these are different images of God, and this is the image we follow, but it's the one God. So most Indian believers are actually monotheists.
And then with Buddhism, you might almost argue that it has evolved beyond monotheism in the sense that it's moved to a higher level of abstraction.
Yeah. That's right, And the interesting thing is that in practice on the ground, a lot of Buddhism is highly devotional. You might think it ought not to be, since there's no God, but in practice, people will make offerings to a Buddha image, and they will pray, and they will ask for the Buddha to help them. So although perhaps it ought not to happen in theory, there is that devotional side.
Oh yeah, and I think people in the West have a somewhat kind of sterilized view of what actual Buddhism is in the East, because the variant that people might practice in America, say, is devoid of a lot of that ritual, and it's devoid of a lot of the supernatural belief that you find in practicing Buddhism.
Yes, I think most practicing Buddhists in Buddhist countries would actually accept the existence of lots of gods, lots of supernatural beings with whom you can have relationships. It's just they're sort of devalued a little bit. They're not as important. And, so there you might even say, but this is pushing it really, but as you put it rather well, I think that they've transcended both polytheism and monotheism into looking at what reality is like ultimately. Yeah.
In fact, this is maybe a heretical argument to present to someone who is a member of the clergy here at Christ Church College. But in a certain sense, if you look at the trajectory of religious evolution, in a certain sense, could you argue that Buddhism is more highly evolved in the sense that it has followed the trajectory further? First of all, in that sense, in the sense of the conceptualization of God going kind of beyond monotheism into abstraction, but also in the sense that in the intensity of the emphasis on surrendering the ego, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I am a Christian minister, so I'm probably not going to say that Buddhists have evolved further than Christians.
I wasn't expecting assent. I just thought I might provoke an interesting reaction.
Yeah. I think that Buddhist tradition of stressing that which is beyond the personal in the divine, and also the emphasis on overcoming greed, hatred, and delusion, is something Christians can very profitably learn from. But as a Christian, I would say, well, what Buddhists don't really have a place for is the idea of a creator God who is also a redeemer God. And they don't have any place for that. And I would have thought that in modern science, for example, the idea of a creator God is an advance on the idea of just things happening to be there. I mean, if you say to a classical Buddhist, why does the world exist? They just say, well, it does. It's not an interesting question. It's just you're in suffering, you want to get out of it. Don't ask these theoretical questions. Whereas monotheism, at its best, will press the theoretical question and say, well, why does the universe exist? Does it have a purpose? Is there one underlying wise, beautiful goal which is there? Does that make sense? And I would have thought the strength of monotheism is it actually does relate very well to modern science in its quest for underlying intelligibility and purpose. If you can make that quest out, then monotheism is going to be a desirable goal. And in that sense, well, I'm about to say this as a Christian, you might think, but in that sense, I think monotheism is not a less evolved view, but is one which is deeply consonant with some of the best scientific insights.
But a final word I might say on behalf of Buddhism is, if you look at what the Buddha actually said, I wouldn't say he so much confronted science as avoided conflict with it by virtue of which questions he chose to address and which questions he didn't choose to address. He specifically said, I don't get into, really deeply metaphysical, whether there's a God, what the nature of the afterlife is, and so on.
That's right. That's true. It's quite true. But at the same time, I'm not wanting to have a competition in which I win, but you'd have to say...
I'm not a Buddhist, by the way, so I can't win regardless of what happens.
Right.
But.
What I'd say here is that Buddhism is quite strongly bound up with belief in rebirth, reincarnation.
True.
Now, a lot of people do believe that in the West. Christians, on the whole, don't. And I think a good grasp of science and genetics makes it quite difficult to believe in rebirth, and I think that it's something you either believe in or you don't. Now, if you're a Buddhist, you on the whole would believe in it, or that would be a major plank. So that is a doctrine about the nature of human destiny in life, which I would find it difficult to accept, and so I wouldn't say it's quite true that the Buddha has no interest in doctrines at all. He does assume that it's true, that there are millions of rebirths for every human being. Mm-hmm. And if you don't think that, if you think that every human soul is created once anew at birth, and that it is then offered eternal life with God, but doesn't reincarnate on earth, well, there again you've got a difference. That's one of the differences, you know, between the faiths, and you just have to say, well, this is the one I think is more true with my very limited appreciation of these things, and I myself don't think rebirth is a very convincing doctrine. Uh-huh. But that would be a consideration. You know, you'd have to say that's one of the things I'd have to consider. Do I really take a worldview, including rebirth, or not?
I mean, some people have the same kind of trouble with the Christian notion of an afterlife.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah, certainly. Yeah, all religions have their problems.
Yeah. Well, one reason I'm pressing you about Buddhism and Christianity and all the great faiths is it does seem to me in the modern world more than before there is a need to kind of talk about these things. Yeah. It seems to me one of the, if you talk about challenges to religion in the modern world, one challenge that's often talked about is science, absorbing the scientific worldview. Yeah. But the other is that in a globalized society, you're more and more conscious of the existence of other faiths. It seems harder to defend the idea that one particular part of humanity has been privy to all the deep insights into the nature of things. And so it's important to kind of talk about what kind of validity they might all have. Yep. And I'm wondering, although you're a Christian minister, if someone converts from, if someone who had no religion at all before becomes a practicing Buddhist, do you think in some sense they have kind of entered your fold?
I think they've certainly entered the spiritual fold, and I think that was rather good. And most of us in Britain, and probably in the States too, know people who are Buddhists, and they're liable to be very good Buddhists because they're choosing to do this, and they're going to take it seriously, otherwise they wouldn't bother. So they're not just going to be conventional Buddhists, they're going to take the life of meditation very seriously. I think that was wholly a good thing. And I wouldn't try to convert them to Christianity. I mean, I wouldn't conceal my own beliefs, and if we talked, I'd say what my beliefs were, but I wouldn't consider it necessary for their salvation that they become Christian.
Of these kind of two challenges to religion in the modern world, one being the manifest presence of other robust faiths, you know, from the point of view of Christianity, say, or from the point of view of Buddhism. The other being scientific worldview. You've also paid attention to the second challenge quite a bit, I think.
Yeah.
What's your general feeling for how a religious sensibility survives the onslaught of modern science?
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's been any onslaught of modern science. I think that contemporary science grew out of a theistic worldview, and most of the great scientists have been believers in God and have been explicitly driven by that. I mean, the crucial cases are very well known, Isaac Newton and Michael Faraday and so on. And that religious motivation is very important because you're looking to see the intelligibility and the beauty of God's universe. So you have the belief that you can understand it, it's mind-like, it's mathematically structured, the mind is suitable for understanding it. So, I mean, I've just always seen the scientific way as part of a theistic approach to the universe. And so there's no onslaught. The rather contemporary and very minority view of scientific atheism is, I think, just a blip on human consciousness, which won't last very long, and it's just because people are fed up with organized religion properly. It's got nothing to do with their science. I mean, I know very well some of the great scientific atheists of the modern world, and they're driven by something deeply emotional, if I can say that, rather than by strict scientific evidence, which doesn't at all show what they say it does.
Well, I guess the reason I use the word onslaught is because you titled one of your books Defending the Soul.
Oh, yes.
And the idea was that it was, the notion of the soul was under attack from a certain variant, at least, of scientific materialism, or a certain offshoot of scientific materialism.
Materialism, that's right. Yeah, and I talk about people like Freud and Marx and a number of different variants. And certainly, yes, there has been a sort of onslaught on religious belief, particularly in Europe, since the 17th century. But I don't think it's scientifically based. In fact, it's mostly anti-science. I mean, if you look at Freud and Marx, the two of the main people I talk about, a lot of people today would say they weren't scientists at all. They were just ideologists. They had these ideologies that they were determined to force science into. But scientific evidence for Freud or for Marx, it just doesn't exist, and it's not there.
Well, let me ask you this. Do you think that there are people who are immersed in the scientific worldview who have a naive idea about how much it can explain? About how many questions are left over after you've answered the questions you can answer scientifically?
I suppose there are some people who think there are no questions left over. I know that E.O. Wilson, in his book, what did he call that book again?
Consilience?
Consilience, yes. Said, tongue-in-cheek, I think, really, or as he put it, skating on thin ice, that all questions were scientific questions, and once you'd answered them, there was nothing left. But I can't think for a moment he really believes that, because he doesn't get on with his own personal life in that way. Questions of importance, value, meaning, purpose, just don't come within the sciences. So, I mean, I would have thought no reasonable philosopher takes this view. I mean, nobody who's thought about what science is and what it can do takes the view that all questions are scientific questions.
I do think E.O. Wilson has made a point of not ruling out a kind of deistic interpretation of evolution, the idea that evolution was set in motion to achieve some larger goal.
I'm sure that's true. He's got a number of levels of increasing tongue-in-cheekness, and the lowest level he gets to is, oh, well, it's all scientific questions. So if God is a scientific question, you could give it a scientific answer.
But is he, I guess there are other exemplars of the problem of, as you see it, of people kind of overextending science's power or its reign.
There certainly are, yes. And one of the best known is Richard Dawkins in this university, with whom I've had quite a number of public debates.
Oh, have you?
Yes.
How did you find him?
Oh, utterly charming, brilliant debater, terribly popular, unfortunately, and nearly always wins the debate. But his views are naive. I mean, I have to say they're naive. When he talks about biology and genetics, he knows what he's talking about, of course, and I listen, and I wouldn't contradict what he says about that. But when he then goes on to talk about the fact that genetics shows that there can't be any purpose in the universe at all, and that it all must be, what he calls a selfish gene, sort of carrying out their little wars, and that human beings are just machines for carrying genes around. He's not talking science there. He's talking something else. He's virulently anti-religious. And I think that's what you have to say. I mean, it's got nothing to do with his science. He just hates religion. Why that is, I wouldn't like to say. But he does hate it. And
you know but won't say, or you?
Oh, I've got a pretty good idea.
Oh, boy. I'd love to entice you into talking about it.
Well, the basic idea is quite simple. The basic fact is quite simple. There are certain forms of religion which are anti-intellectual and anti-scientific, and which do say, the universe was created in 6 days, and these were 24 hours each, and that's it. And which are also emotionally pressuring. And those forms of religion are not as strong in England at all as they are in America, but they do exist, and he's encountered them, and he's encountered them personally, and his view of religion is molded by that fact.
You wrote in, I think, Defending the Soul, that the sciences point to a spiritual basis for the world. In other words, they're not just compatible with that idea, but even almost imply that.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
I think that. Well, again, because the idea that the universe is intelligible, has elegantly structured laws, is an amazing idea, and we have no right to expect the universe should be like that. Mm-hmm. And I think people I talk to here in Oxford who were working in genetics, whether they're believers in God or not, are just absolutely overwhelmed with awe at the structure of DNA, which is necessary to get this thing off the ground. And it just seems so utterly miraculous, using that in a non-religious sense, that it's bound to make people think, well, there's something going on here. I don't know what it is. And I think that's the reaction of any good scientist. You know, there's something amazing. And the most natural way to take that would be, well, this looks like a universe which is meant to be the way it is. It's not, it's got its puzzles. I mean, why is there so much waste, in inverted commas, in evolution and so on? So you've got to deal with those. But the general facts of design and organization and integration and complexification are just overwhelming, I think. So it's, to me, that makes a very natural affinity with a religious view.
Speaking of the waste in evolution, which often assumes the form of pain and suffering.
Yes.
Do you have a generic line on the problem of evil, as in some ways magnified by our knowledge of evolution in a sense?
I do. My line is very similar to that of Arthur Peacock, which is that chance is a necessary factor in any universe which allows creative freedom. Mm-hmm. And that if you didn't have that element of undetermined causality within defined limits, there wouldn't be any space for creativity and freedom. And so I think, for myself, I know that not all Christians would accept this, but I think it's one of the insights produced by the merging, really, of scientific and Christian views in the modern world, that the role of chance in the universe is a very positive and creative one, but it has a price. And my general approach to the existence of evil is, well, that price is inevitable. It's just part of the necessity of the way things are, but it is necessary to directional progress, which allows creative freedom.
Mm-hmm. Suffering is the price of freedom.
Yeah, really. But we've made it a lot worse, I mean, than it had to be.
Right.
Yeah.
That's one of the virtues of freedom, is you could change the ratio of suffering to freedom if you used your freedom wisely, I guess.
Yeah.
Although, of course, one reply would be a truly omnipotent God presumably could have designed a universe in which there wasn't this trade-off, in which there wasn't this price to be paid for freedom.
I think that's too easy. I mean, I don't know what an omnipotent God could have done. I mean, you can say that. Yeah. But I think we have no idea at all of what an omnipotent God could do. And all I can say about that is, well, God has more power than any other being could conceivably have. That's the traditional view. But what that is, and what the limits on God's power might be in God himself, I haven't the slightest idea. I have no way of knowing. I feel like Job, you know, I just bow in wonder. I can't work that out. So I don't think that's a strong argument. I don't.
So in your view, to say God is omnipotent is not to say that there weren't, in some sense, constraints on God's own creative freedom.
That's right. I mean, most Christian philosophers have said God's being is necessarily what it is. It could not be otherwise. It has its perfection because God is perfect beauty and contemplates that perfect beauty, and as such is perfect. I mean, worthwhile for his own sake. But maybe it's true that God has to create, and maybe it's true that any creation of free beings has to involve the possibility of suffering. I mean, how do I know? But it could be true. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, there could be constraints on any conceivable being. And I think although it sounds new and it stresses chance more than traditional views, that's exactly what very traditional theists like Thomas Aquinas said. I mean, that evil is somehow necessary to creation. It's, they used to call it a privation in medieval times, a privation of being, meaning it's a sort of shadow cast by, in a painting, for example. The shadows are necessary to the painting as a whole. It's an analogy that St. Augustine used, and I think we have to be a little bit humble about knowing what an omnipotent God is able to do and thinking we could do better.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure I couldn't do better.
Right. And all you have to say then is, and nobody could.
Yeah. No, I was just wondering if God could have done better, but in your view,
I think
God was doing the best he or she could with the fabric that was available to
God is the greatest conceivable being and the greatest possible being, but we don't know what that is, and we might think there could be a greater being, but we're just mouthing babble, really. We don't know what we're talking about.
You've, I believe you said in one of your books that all the great religions are about, among other things, convincing people that in some sense they are living in a world of illusion. Is that fair?
A world of appearance, perhaps, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, can you elaborate on that a little?
Well, the way things seem to us very often conceals what they're really like. Science gives a very good case of that. I mean, that we look at the world and it's made of coloured shapes buzzing about, and we think that's what the world is like. But any physicist will say that's not what the world is like. It's not. There are no colours actually at all, and the shapes aren't what you think they are. That's just a function of what size your eyes are and what you can make out. But actually, what you've got are these little, perhaps superstrings, or quarks or electrons, all buzzing around without any colours at all, and not the shapes you think they have. So the appearance, well, how it appears to human beings with our cognitive equipment, is very different from the reality. But we can tell that difference because we can successively show how what we seem to see can't be what really is there. And it's the same in religion, really, that the way we see the world depends very much on our own temperaments, but it often seems like a mess, a lot of accident, a lot of chaos, one damn thing after another, as Henry Ford said. But as a matter of fact, a theist would certainly say, no, the universe is intelligible, beautiful, elegant. It has deep structures of necessity and purpose. And in fact, it has a spiritual reality as the most dominant factor of the whole thing. I mean, the presence of God is the most important thing about life. Now, most people don't even recognize that. So the appearance of this rather accidental universe with no spiritual presence at all is very different from the reality, which is it's a deeply providential universe guided by an omnipresent spirit.
So in some ways you would say that it isn't just that people fail to appreciate the limits that science actually has as a means of enlightenment and in terms of what it sheds light on, but that science itself is pointing to these limits. If you look at actually what modern physics is showing us about the fundamental fabric of reality and the extent to which we can or cannot actually comprehend it, science is in that sense kind of defines its own limits. Almost.
Yes, I think in a strange way, although modern science probably began in the 16th, 17th century by rejecting Platonism, the view that everything is an image of spiritual realities, and putting in its place an attention to the empirical and the observable and what happened. Contemporary physics has almost reversed that and said, well, you mustn't attend too much to what actually happens. I mean, certainly there are experiments. They're too expensive to do, many of them. Actually, you see the beauty of the universe by doing pure mathematics. So you do have to look at the empirical, but nevertheless what's really going on is a deeply intellectual investigation into a structure which none of us can ever observe. And that's a sort of reversion to a Platonistic or spiritual view of the universe, to say, well, the deepest reality is something mind-like rather than just unconscious and accidental. And I think that is a pronounced feature of contemporary physics. So my physicist colleagues tell me. I have to say I'm not the great authority on this.
Yeah.
I just ask the physicists.
I generally have to trust physicists when it comes to interpreting
Yeah.
physics myself. Well, listen, thank you very much. This has been very, very enjoyable and fascinating.
Good, thank you.